My name is Margaret Hale, and I've learned that silence has a sound. It isn't empty. It creaks like cold wood, sighs like a window that won't quite shut, and hums the way a broken promise does when the wind remembers it. The night it began to end, there was snow up to the window panes, the kind of snow that keeps you inside with your thoughts and the fire that's burning too low. I was 39 years old, and I still believed that hard work could keep a person safe. My husband, Raymond, used to say Vermont winters build character. He never stayed long enough to see if mine survived. He left in February of 1952, took the truck, the bank book, and the better half of my good name. The sheriff came a week later with a paper that said the land we'd spent 15 years paying for wasn't ours anymore. Apparently, Raymond had leveraged it. That's the word the man used. And now the leverage had snapped. I remember the sheriff wouldn't meet my eyes. He kept his hat in his hands and said, "I'm sorry, Maggie. Folks thought he was solid." I said, "Solid things don't run." And I closed the door before my voice could crack. If you're still here, tell me, have you ever stood in a house that suddenly felt like someone else's memory? That's what it was like. Every board, every nail, every winter coat on the hook, all of it still mine by habit, not by law. The first night alone, the stove went out. The wind pushed through the seams of the old farmhouse, whistling like it wanted to finish what he'd started. I wrapped myself in his old wool coat and sat on the floor beside the hearth, striking match after match, just to watch the light exist for a few seconds. That's when I realized something simple and terrible. No one was coming to fix this. Not the sheriff, not the neighbors, not God. Just me and my two hands, raw from work, unsteady from shock, but mine. In the days that followed, people came by with advice disguised as pity. "Sell what you can," Mrs. Keene said, standing on my porch like a crow with morals. "You can take the bus to Montpelier, find work at the glove factory." "I can make do here," I said. She frowned. "This house isn't fit for a woman alone." I wanted to tell her. Neither was the world, but I let her talk. It's easier for some people to give you escape routes than to watch you walk the hard one. After she left, I walked the perimeter of the land, what used to be mine, with snow up to my knees and the cold eating through my boots. The barn groaned like an old man in prayer. Inside, the air smelled of pine, dust, and the life we'd almost built. Raymond's tools hung on the wall, hammer, plane, chisel, waiting for a man who wasn't coming back. I touched the handle of the hammer. It fit my hand like a memory. That's when the idea came. Not lightning, more like a small, steady flame. If he could build a house, so could I. If he could leave me with nothing, I could learn to make something again. I started with the small things: a broken chair leg, a cracked cabinet hinge, the pump handle out back that stuck in the morning freeze. I sanded, glued, oiled. The first time the handle turned and water came up clean, I laughed so hard I scared the crows off the fence. It wasn't triumph. It was survival that finally remembered how to make a sound. But freedom is never free in a town that remembers everything. By the first thaw, the roof started to leak. I climbed up there with a tarp and a hammer. Half the nails bent, my hands blistered, and the wind nearly took me once. But when I nailed the last corner down, I felt taller than the church steeple in town. Below me, The valley lay half frozen, half born again. Maple sap ran like clear tears from the trees. Smoke curled from distant chimneys. Everything looked ordinary, except me. Because that was the day I stopped waiting for rescue. That night, I sat by the fire I'd built myself, calluses stinging, hair smelling of pine tar and smoke. The house was still cold, the future still uncertain, but I could feel the smallest heartbeat of pride, like the land had started listening to me again. And I said to no one, "They took my comfort, my name, my belonging, but they didn't take my hands." Outside, snow began to fall again, slow, quiet, forgiving.
It felt like a reckoning. Snow receded, revealing what winter had hidden. Broken shingles, swollen doors, and debts waiting like wolves on the ridge. The first letter came in March, cream envelope, courthouse seal. A foreclosure notice, final and polite. I read it 3 times before folding it neatly and sliding it under a candle holder, the way you hide bad weather until it decides whether to stay. I told myself I'd find a way. I'd always found a way. If you're still here, tell me, have you ever lived on the edge of losing everything, but refused to move back? That's where I lived, between stubbornness and prayer. Every Saturday, I walked into town with my hair pinned tight and my chin steady. The general store smelled of coffee and sawdust, and the men by the counters stopped talking when I entered. Their silence was sharper than any gossip. "Morning, Mrs. Hale," Mr. Burton said, too kindly. His wife's eyes followed me down the aisle, counting what I could afford. I bought nails, lamp oil, salt, and 1 pencil. When I placed the coins on the counter, he said softly, "Heard about the property. You can always rent the caretaker's cabin by the mill." "I've got my own roof," I said. "Not for long, I reckon." "Then I better patch it faster." He smiled at that, the kind of smile men give when they realize you mean it. By April, the mud swallowed wagon wheels. I stayed home, chopping wood, mending fences, writing lists of what I'd fix next. The silence became company. The ache in my arms became proof. Then one afternoon I found something under a loose floorboard in the barn, a small tin box, sealed with rust. Inside were receipts, pawn slips, and a key. Raymond's name, scrawled in his impatient hand, ran across them like a confession. He'd pawned my father's tools, the set I'd kept since I was 17, to cover his gambling. And the key? It belonged to a storage shed by the river road, registered to R. Hale and Sons. I stood there holding it, every sound around me gone quiet, except the wind moving through the barn rafters. That's when the shaking started. Not fear, not even grief. Anger that slept all winter finally woke up and stretched its legs. The next morning, I walked the 2 miles to the river road. The shed was small, gray, and half buried in last year's leaves. The padlock was stiff, but the key turned easily, like it was waiting for me. Inside, stacked against the wall, were wood planks, iron nails, and old blueprints for a cabin I'd never seen. At the bottom of a crate, wrapped in burlap, was my father's hammer, initials carved into the handle. My knees gave out right there on the dirt floor. I pressed the hammer to my chest and said aloud, "You tried to take everything, Raymond, but you left me the one thing you never understood, how to start over." I spent the next week hauling those planks back to the farm, one sled load at a time.
Neighbor saw me pass, nodded, whispered. The widow Hale was up to something again. They weren't wrong. I decided to build a small workshop beside the barn, just big enough for a table, a stove, and a woman who needed to make something with her own hands. No blueprints, just instinct and trial. I laid the first board crooked, cursed, and started again. The days blurred. I learned that wood listens if you're patient. It groans, settles, forgives. I learned that blisters harden into calluses the same way grief becomes endurance. And I learned that the smell of fresh cut pine can trick a lonely house into believing it's alive again. In May, I made my first piece, a simple stool. The legs wobbled, the varnish streaked, but it held weight. I tested it by standing on top of it, reaching for the beam above. For the first time in months, I was taller than my sorrow. By June, word got around that Maggie Hale knew her way around a hammer. It started as mockery, then turned into curiosity. Old Mr. Dodson came by with a broken chair. Then Mrs. Keene brought a cupboard door just to see. By July, I was trading repairs for food, eggs, flour, firewood. It wasn't charity, it was barter. That mattered. But not everyone liked it. One Sunday, the pastor preached a sermon about women leaving their proper place. He didn't say my name, but the air knew. After church, he stopped me by the door and said, "A woman's strength should be gentle, Mrs. Hale." I looked him in the eye and said, "So should a man's." He didn't speak to me again that summer. That same week, a letter arrived from my sister in Massachusetts. She'd heard the rumors. She wrote, "Margaret, you've become the story mothers tell their daughters not to repeat." I folded the letter and used it to start the evening fire. It burned fast and clean. If you're still listening, tell me, have you ever been called too much when you were just finally being enough? By autumn, the workshop stood complete. A single window looked west toward the mountain. In the evenings, light spilled through it like honey. The floor was uneven, but it was mine. I carved my initials into the doorframe, M.H. 1953, and hung my father's hammer on a nail beside it. When the first snow came early that year, I didn't feel trapped. I felt grounded. But freedom, I was learning, never arrives alone. It brings company, in the form of people who want to test it. One evening in December, a figure came up the drive. A man in a heavy coat, carrying something under his arm. I recognized the walk before the face. Raymond. Older, thinner, but unmistakably him. He stopped by the porch rail and said, "You look well." I didn't answer. He set a folded paper on the step, a deed, stamped and official. I bought it back, the land. I figured it should stay in the family. "I am the family," I said. He nodded, eyes shifting. I thought maybe, no. He flinched, half smiling like the coward he'd always been. "You've changed." "I finally fit the shape of what you left behind," I said. He looked past me to the workshop. "Built that yourself?" "Yes." He ran a hand over his jaw. "I suppose you don't need much from me now. Not even your permission." He stared at me, long and quiet, like he wanted to find the woman he'd known and couldn't. Then he said, "I'm sorry." I believed him, but I didn't forgive him. Not yet. He turned to leave. Before he reached the road, I called out, "You can keep the deed. I've already claimed what's mine." That night, I didn't sleep. The snow outside glowed blue under the moon.
I sat by the window and whispered to the darkness, I am my own inheritance now. It sounded strange at first, then truer each time I said it. If you're still here, tap the heart or tell me, have you ever built something not to prove them wrong, but to prove yourself right? By autumn, I would find the courage to use that workshop for more than repairs. By then, the town would learn that what they dismissed as stubbornness was actually a craft. And I would learn that healing, like carpentry, begins when you stop asking what's broken and start asking what's still strong. The winter after Raymond returned was the hardest I can remember. The kind of cold that bites the inside of your nose and freezes the kettle before the whistle. Every morning I'd have to break the ice off the water bucket with the hammer that had once been my father's. That sound, iron against ice, became my clock, my prayer, my proof that I was still here. By January, the town had grown used to me again, though not comfortable. The same people who'd whispered behind mittens now stopped by with a favor, pretending not to need my hands. I mended fence posts, fixed sleds, carved window frames for the schoolhouse. It wasn't charity, it was work, and work has a way of erasing the wrong kind of pity. Then, one morning, a letter arrived, sealed in thick wax, not from a neighbor, from the Vermont Furniture Guild in Montpelier. They'd heard about the widow who builds. A man named Mr. Orville Cutter wrote, "If your craftsmanship is as sound as reported, we'd like to see your work." My first thought was that someone was playing a joke. The second was that maybe, just maybe, God has a sense of timing. I spent 3 weeks shaping something that would speak for me. A rocking chair made from maple planks salvaged from the old barn rafters. I sanded until the grain felt like skin. I carved my initials on the underside where only honesty would look. And on the back rail, I burned a small line with my branding iron. What they took from me, I rebuilt with my hands. When it was finished, I sat in it. It didn't creak. It didn't give. It just held. If you're still here, tell me, have you ever made something that felt more like a confession than an accomplishment? That's what that chair was. Getting to Montpelier meant leaving before dawn. I loaded the chair into the borrowed truck and wrapped it in burlap. The road was a river of slush and mud, and twice I thought about turning back. But the thought of Raymond's face, of anyone's face if I gave up, kept my foot steady on the pedal. The Guild building stood near the train station, tall, clean, and smelling faintly of varnish and pride. Men in pressed coats looked up as I carried my chair through the door. One of them laughed under his breath. Another cleared his throat. Mr. Cutter himself, a heavy man with eyes like polished walnut, said, "Mrs. Hale, we don't often see women applying for membership." "Then maybe it's time you did," I said. He raised an eyebrow but motioned me toward a table. "Let's see it then." I unwrapped the chair. The room went quiet. They walked around it like appraisers at a silent auction. One man ran his hand along the curve of the armrest. Another squinted at the joinery. Finally, Cutter said, "It's not fancy, but it's honest." "I'll take that as scripture," I said. He smiled. "Where'd you learn?" "In a barn," I said. "After everything else failed." He nodded once. "We'll be in touch." On the drive home, the wind was against me, but it didn't feel like resistance. It felt like company.
By the time I reached the valley, the snow had started again, thick, soft, and relentless. I parked, carried the chair inside, and sat by the window waiting for nothing in particular. The house creaked, the fire popped, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to talk to ghosts. 2 weeks later, a telegram arrived. Accepted. Your work shows strength and care. Bring more pieces in spring. Cutter. Vermont Furniture Guild. I read it twice, then once more just to make sure the words didn't change. Then I laughed, a sound that startled even me. It came from deep in the ribs like thawing earth. I pinned the telegram to the wall above the stove, right where the morning light could hit it. Proof that a woman's name could stand without a man's shadow beside it. That spring, I took on my first apprentice, Tommy Keene, Mrs. Keene's youngest boy, 16, restless, good with tools, but better with silence. He'd lost his father in the mill fire 2 years earlier and needed something to hold on to. I knew the feeling. He swept the shop, sharpened blades, and listened more than he spoke. I taught him to read wood grain like weather. He taught me that teaching can heal the parts of you that building can't. Sometimes he'd ask me, "Why don't you put a sign out front? Let folks know this is a real shop." "Because the ones who need me will find me," I said. "They always do." In June, a man from the bank came by again. New suit, same tone. He looked around the yard, the barn, the workshop, then back at me. "You're doing all right, Mrs. Hale," he said, almost surprised. "You've got income now. Maybe we can restore your claim on the land." I looked at the hills behind him, green and alive. "I don't need permission to belong to what I've already earned," I said. He took off his hat. "You know, my wife bought one of your chairs at the county fair. Says it's the only one that doesn't wobble." "Then she and I have something in common," I said. "We've learned how to stay steady." That summer, Raymond came once more. He stood outside the fence this time, hat in hand. I was planing wood by the open door. The smell of cedar filled the air. He said, "I just wanted to see it. What you built." "Then look," I said, not stopping my work. He nodded, his eyes on the shop walls, the stack of finished chairs, the smoke curling from the chimney. "You did this alone," he said. "Yes," I said, "but I was never lonely. There's a difference." He took a breath, like he might say something else, then just whispered, "I'm glad." And for the first time, I believed him. It didn't change the past, but it softened it, like snow melting from a roof that no longer leaks. That night, I opened my ledger and wrote a new entry at the top. H and Hands Custom Woodcrafts. Not Widow Hale, not Mrs. Raymond Hale. Just Hale and Hands. Because that's all I ever needed to begin with. If you're still here, tell me, have you ever realized that the very thing that broke you was also the thing that built your strength? Maybe you're there now, sanding the edges, finding the balance. Keep at it. The grain will show you who you are. The work grew. The hands healed. The town forgot its whispers and started ordering tables. And I finally stopped asking why me and started asking, what now? By the time 20 winters had come and gone, the little workshop that started with a hammer and a broken promise had turned into something real. The sign above the door read Hale and Hands, carved from maple and darkened by years of sun. It creaked a little in the wind, and that sound, that gentle wood against wood groan, was the closest thing I knew to music. I'm telling this now as an old woman because some stories are too heavy to carry forever. They have to be set down like tools at the end of a long day. The shop still stands, though my hands are slower now. Tommy Keene runs most of it, a fine craftsman, kind heart, steady voice. He signs his work K and Hale, even though I tell him he's earned his own name by now. He says, "You built the roof, Miss Maggie. I'm just keeping it from leaking." I laugh when he says that. The sound feels lighter than it used to, like it knows it belongs in the air. People come from all over Vermont now for our furniture, not because it's fancy, but because it lasts. I tell them that's what happens when things are built with grief and patience. They learn how to stay. Every chair, every table has a small mark somewhere hidden, a single line burned beneath the finish. What they took from me, I rebuilt with my hands. It isn't a slogan, it's scripture. If you're still here, tell me, have you ever looked at something you made and realized it was really making you all along? The house, the barn, the land, all mine again by deed and sweat. But the truest thing I ever owned was the way work quieted my sorrow. When you sand wood long enough, the grain begins to speak. It tells you what direction it wants to go, what knots to leave alone, where it hides its scars. I learned that people aren't much different. Every spring, I still open the window of my old bedroom and let the thawing air in. The same hills roll beyond it, greener now, more forgiving. The mappies whisper the same language they did the day Raymond left, but now the words sound like blessing instead of loss. He died in another town years ago. Someone sent me the notice, neat and formal. I folded it and placed it under the same candle holder where I once hid the foreclosure letter. I didn't cry. I just whispered, "You can rest now. I already have." Last year, a young woman came to the shop, hair tied up in a red kerchief, hands rough from milking. She'd heard about me from her aunt in town, said she wanted to learn how to make things that last. She reminded me of myself. Same watchful eyes, same small defiance hiding under her politeness. I gave her a chisel, showed her how to listen for the grain. She caught on quick. One afternoon she asked, "Didn't it bother you how they talked about you?" I smiled. It used to. Then I realized the noise was just proof that I was doing something new.
She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. Maybe that's how change happens. One woman teaching another that she doesn't need permission to keep what's hers. That winter, I took the last rocking chair I ever made and placed it by the front window. It was maple like the first, simple, solid, a little rough in the corners, honest, just like me. I sit in it most mornings with my tea, watching the snow gather on the porch rail. The wind slips through the cracks and carries sawdust scent through the house. It smells like every life I've lived. Loss, work, wood, and grace. Sometimes the bells from the church down in town drift up the valley, echoing through the cold air. They sound softer now. Even the world's judgment mellows with distance. One evening, as the last light fell across the shop, I found Thomas sanding a tabletop, careful as a prayer. He said, "You'll slow down now, won't you?" I smiled. A tree doesn't stop standing just because it's old. It just grows quieter. He nodded, then added, "You always said work is what keeps us alive." Work and forgiveness, in that order. He didn't answer, just kept sanding. The light on the wood looked like fire and water at once. Everything I ever learned glowing right in front of me. That night, I dreamed of my father's hammer. It wasn't in my hand this time. It was resting on a windowsill, sunlight on the handle, no longer needed. When I woke, I felt light, as if something had been set down. I walked out to the shop,
touched each tool on the wall and whispered thanks. Then I stepped outside. The snow had started again, slow and forgiving. I closed my eyes and let it land on my face, cold, clean, and real. If you're still here, tell me in the comments, have you ever rebuilt yourself piece by piece until the world had to call you whole again? That's what I did, and it was worth every splinter. Because here on True Life Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember them. We speak them out loud so someone else might pick up their own hammer, their own heart, and begin. Subscribe, stay with us, and help the silence end, one true story at a time.